Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Jeff Brown, President of FGE. Great to have you with us today, Jeff.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. Lots to talk about. I think we'll be talking bigger picture stuff, really, but we can get into the nitty-gritty of one or two parts of the energy market. Let's start with just today, this week, and talk a bit about geopolitical risk because we haven't, we've seen that play in and out of the price and the market in the last few months for the obvious reasons that I'm not going to mention.
Mhm.
But it's virtually into negative territory now, is my feeling. And particularly, we saw a bit of activity over the weekend between Israel and Iran, and yet we saw energy prices open quite a way down yesterday. Um, has geopolitical risk gone completely out the window?
Yeah, it sure seems like it's pricing out, right? And as you said, the market has decided for now that everything will be calm for the foreseeable future. Probably it's and obviously the focus now will shift back toward demand where there's worries. What is OPEC going to do? Are they going to add barrels? The
Yeah.
one thing I would flag in the background is that inventories are still tracking low, right? And they're at low levels. So anytime we get worries coming back again, we don't have a huge amount of sort of, oil available. I mean, because we're carrying lower inventories. So you can always get a pop again.
Okay, but I mean, we don't have a lot of oil available today, but we do have a lot of oil off the market.
Yes.
6 million barrels a day from OPEC plus. And let's talk a bit of, so in that way, the cushion is there, I suppose, which is probably what's keeping,
Yeah.
prices under control, despite all this geopolitical sort of nervousness in the market. But let's talk a bit about OPEC because, very soon, in the next few weeks, they're planning to add a few barrels in December, but the plan is to incrementally add. And the people we talk to in the market are, I'd say, evenly split. Some are saying, look, they have to go forward with this because for credibility purposes, etc. Others are saying they'd be mad to do that, even to bring on a bit of oil because demand is still very weak, and so they'd be shooting themselves in the foot. Would you say that they kind of need to now add the oil, having postponed it already once?
Well, maybe it's useful to just bring some numbers to the table a little bit to understand exactly what they're confronting. I mean, we have demand growing by about 1.1, 1.2 million barrels a day this year and next year. And if you look
Mm.
at how much non-OPEC supply is coming in, and this is what they've been dealing with this over the last couple of years. Uh, if you take everything outside of OPEC, it's about 2 million barrels a day this year and 1.6 next year. Now, people focus a lot on crude, but you have to remember there's biofuels coming in, there's NGLs. It's big numbers. So
Mm.
they've dealt with this well to get, with all the cuts. But going ahead, when we look out to 2025, if they bring all these barrels that they planned into the market, we could see prices go, frankly, certainly down to the 60s, even touch into the 50s if they stuck with that plan. Now, of course, they have other things they want to do. They want to get all the people that have been cheating on their quotas,
Yeah.
not been compliant. They want to rein them back in, and that's well known. I mean, you're nodding. Everyone knows they're trying to do this. The challenge as we see it is that everyone's been talking and they haven't been doing it.
Yeah.
If they can get those guys, the Iraqs of the world and others um, to become compliant, then that gives them some room. Again, throwing one other number at you, we would show for September, we would show overall the non-compliant members overproducing by 600,000 barrels a day. And if they wanted to do the compensation that they've been pledging, that would be another 700,000 barrels a day. So that would go a long way to giving some room to bring barrels back. But of course, the market gets watching all this right now, right?
Of course, of course. And that seems to be the key, isn't it? So really it's an internal issue for OPEC. I mean, they can continue to hope that demand will pick up, but yes, people have said if they can just get that under control, then yes, the market would even
Yeah.
start to feel a bit tight. And it certainly allow those incremental barrels to come back from the voluntary cuts next year. So But again, some people saying that, very hard to see how Iraq can come under control in terms of complying for the time being. It certainly hasn't seemed to have done so so far. You just cited the September figures. Jeff, let's talk a bit about demand then, because, obviously that's the other side of the equation. And let's talk about the China picture. And then I'd like to ask you a little bit about how the outlooks are going to pan out perhaps next year. But China demand this year, disappointed a little bit, but the market has adjusted. How much is the market banking on the fact that there could be an improvement in that next year, or is it going to be conservative and assume that we'll see the same from a China oil demand
Well,
point
I
of
mean,
view?
China, coming out of COVID in 23, it grew by 1.6 million barrels a day. This year, we think it's going to grow by about one tenth that. It's below 200,000 barrels a day. And there's two things going on. One of them is, of course, all the macro headlines that we see on the news all the time, economy slowing down, housing issues. That's definitely a drag. Could that improve next year? That's
Mm.
partly, it could. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of room in sight for it to improve radically, but we've built in some improvement with stimulus, I should say. And we do think some stimulus is coming. But there are two structural things going on as well, which are big for China.
Mm.
One of them is the well-known EV story, and the EVs are it it hasn't impacted total demand yet. We're plateauing demand, but what's done is it's knocked out about 150,000 barrels a day of growth we would have seen in gasoline this year. So you have to be careful. It's killing the growth off.
Yeah.
It's and that's one thing. So that's part of the story that's missing. And the other thing is this LNG that's been going into trucking in a big way in China, and that's also knocked 150 kbd roughly off of growth. So if we had those two structural issues still going, China would be growing like its normal picture, the 600 kbd we've gotten used to. But those structural issues are there. The EVs are going to continue coming. So we don't expect that to change. On the LNG trucking, that can change ahead. It very much depends on gas prices within China.
Okay, great. Well, that's interesting. And as you said, you expect one side of that to continue, so that will continue to weigh on that growth in demand. Interesting. And so, Jeff, where does that leave organizations like OPEC, IEA, who are into the job of forecasting assumptions, taking assumptions into consideration? We saw, as we always do, diversions between agencies like that on their outlooks for demand. To this day, we still see, 2024 outlooks differing, although we've got 2 months to go till the end of the year. Do you see that OPEC will come closer to the other agencies in terms of their outlook for 2025? They're a bit more conservative for next year already. Um, is that something the market can look to and rely on, or just leave them to it, if you like, talking their own books?
Yeah, I mean, I've never in my career seen such wide divergence in these areas, right? I think if you look at 24, I think OPEC, I mean, just being frank, I think, they have China growing 700,000 barrels a day. I
Yeah.
just see it, at least last time I looked. It's lower for next year, 1.6. We're obviously at 1.2, so we think they're still too high. In terms of where I would track it through, I'd have to look in detail on where we would disagree. But it seems like obviously they're trying to take a maybe more optimistic view view ahead.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And I mean, but again, it depends on so many things. It said like China, and I don't think the market's nervous about supply for the time being. Let's talk about another event which is coming up very soon, which is the U.S. election.
Mhm.
We will know in 10 days' time, in less than 10 days' time,
Yep.
no, in 8 or 9 days' time, who the new president is of America. Now, will that make any difference, do you think, to the oil markets, the international oil markets, in terms of pricing, nervousness about sanctions, etc.? And also, I'd like you to address the domestic energy policy and whether we'll really see any tangible change there over the course of 4 years if we have a change in administration.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, hopefully we'll know right immediately what
Yes.
happens. In terms of, I think the market, if you look at it, is starting to price in a little bit of Trump win. You look at the betting markets, but not just in that, also when you look at inflation in some other areas, if Trump comes in, there's a thought that he would be more inflationary, and we're starting to see that get priced into the market a little bit. Maybe if Harris comes in, it seems like it's a continuation in policy. If Trump does come, a few things would certainly happen. One thing is he has said that he would um, uh, remove this pause that has been put on new U.S. LNG export projects. So it can have quite a large impact on the gas market if you think, 4 or 5 years ahead, international gas markets. He's talked about a whole lot of other things in terms of pulling from the Paris Accord, doing all kinds of different things. I think realistically for U.S. production, it has very little impact. Oil production grew by 2.8 million barrels a day under Biden. So I don't think it'd have a large impact with Trump. Internationally, of course, there's the sanctions issue. If he chose, he's been a little wishy-washy on what
Mhm.
exactly he would do there, other than to say Biden's handled it horribly. Um, he, this time around, though, if he puts sanctions back on Iran, we think it'll be much, much more difficult to have an impact. So we've built in, if he comes back and puts sanctions on, that it would only take a few 100,000 barrels a day out of the market. One other thing that he's well known for is he wants to put tariffs on everyone for all
Yes.
kinds of things. And last time when we saw a trade war breakout, we estimate that we lost about 250,000 barrels a day of demand around that period due to lower trade and some economic impacts. And this time he's talking about more. So from the demand side, that's there's obviously some drag there.
Mhm.
In terms of pricing overall for oil, it's sort of a mixed bag because he loves to he loves to talk. He loves to we saw before it can lead to $2 or $3 swings in the oil price. And whether he'll focus on sanctions on a day, whether he'll focus on tariffs, I think we have to get ready again for a wild ride in terms of oil sort of flat price.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. You mentioned the oil price again. Let's just go back to where we started a little bit. In terms of the outlook for the oil price, I mean, of course, it depends on so many things, but from a fundamentalist point of view, we're looking at, obviously enough ample supply in reserve with OPEC, and OPEC Plus continues to increase, as you said, its production. Um, and generally a demand weak picture. We mentioned China, but what about the US? We know, and Europe. I mean, just demand overall, global economy, looking forward, inflationary impacts as well. Inflation here to stay despite rate policy. Would you say that we are in for a correction in the global economic performance front for the US, Europe,
Yeah,
maybe more of the same, Asia, rest of Asia, perhaps not just China? Um, Are we going to make that turnaround now?
yeah.
Just
I mean,
following this very, very strong period of post-COVID.
yeah, I mean, of course, it's a risk. I mean, the U.S., the numbers continue to come in quite strong. Everyone's been projecting a U.S. recession for the last 2 years, and everything continues to come in quite strong, which is why, of course, you see worries about inflation coming back again. Uh, Overall, I can say at FGE for our numbers, we don't build in like big recessions or big economic impacts because it drives everything we do, right? So we acknowledge the risk, but all the demand numbers that I talked about and the view I talked about are assuming that the economy continues to perform okay, sort of in line with what we've been seeing recently.
Okay. And I mean, how about let's talk a bit about Russia because obviously that we still have the Russia-Ukraine war going on, no end in sight. Russian oil continues to make it out of the country and to its destinations, India, China, other places. Do you foresee that there'll be any change in those flows next year? Any extra pressure coming onto the Russian economy, the Russian government, from a sort of finance point of view, structurally? For its energy sector, or more of the same?
Well, I mean, there's no sign of it. I mean, obviously, if Trump gets elected, he's promised he'd make a deal. He's been, publicly quite skeptical, obviously, of the Ukraine war and more pro supportive of Putin. So I would think that has to be the wild card you look at as we move through 25. He's been very clear in that area. So if he comes in, we'd have to get ready for big changes potentially in U.S.-Russian policy.
What about US Middle East policy? Do you think that he could choreograph any end to what we're seeing in the region here?
Well, I mean, he always says he can, right? So that
Mm,
he'd make a deal. Again, I think his policies were pretty clear last time around that he'd probably be more supportive of Israel but he also has great friends in the Middle East. So he's, in terms of and been pretty anti-Iran. So I don't think his policies are really a mystery there. It's just that what he considers a deal, frankly,
mm.
we're having a harder time sort of unpacking and saying what would exactly happen there. Um, he'll want to be seen to me making some kind of deal, I think. So I wish I could give you a more precise answer. It's something
Yeah.
we struggle with a bit ourselves.
I think everybody's struggling with what deal could be done at this
Yeah.
stage, with everything in the state that it is. Um, let's talk a little bit, get into the part of the market, which is refining. And there's a lot of talk these days and dynamics around obviously expanding refining capacity here in the Middle East and in Asia. The whole petchem story is taking off in a big way as well, in Middle East Asia as well, in parallel with the European refining sector sort of whittling down, if you like, slowly but surely. What dynamic does that tell us going forward in terms of, how consumers like Europe will fare, as more and more of the capacity moves east, they're going to end up importing more from further away. Is that dynamic a gradual one, would you say, or is it catching up on Europe? Europe's also had to deal with obviously all its gas question following the Russia-Ukraine
Yeah.
war and has had to reorganize itself quite well, admittedly. Future dynamics for refining. Would you say the global south is really, set to dominate? And, West Africa and parts of Africa as well.
Yeah, yeah, and you said Africa. I mean, 100%. I mean, all the additions we're seeing right now, of course, are in emerging markets, right? And that's because that's where the growth is. Uh, Europe is getting hit on all sides. I mean, you mentioned high gas prices, but poor demand out situation, and also everyone worries about carbon ahead and carbon costs. So we will continue to see closures in Europe. We'll actually see them in coastal parts of the U.S. We think as well, and then parts of Asia like Japan. So that dynamic will continue ahead. The thing that's interesting in the refining space is we have all this capacity coming in right now, but from 26 onwards, there's nothing. So, and it's logical. People don't want to build out new refining capacity before we hit peak demand. So we actually think once we weather this storm with the closures that are also coming, refinery margins can be very good in the the second half of the 2020s, just because we have no new capacity. And we know this, right? That has to be under construction already. So we would know what's coming if it was coming.
Okay, interesting. Back just to the upstream, Jeff, and back west to the US. I mean, in terms of US production, I just wanted to address that. At the end of 23, we saw US shale oil production sort of surprised to an extent with a bit more than people were expecting the year to end. This year, it's pretty much stabilized, and we've had a bit more M&A activity. Do you see that, plateauing where we are today, or could anything come in to push it to increase again? As we've seen sort of that consolidation as well happen in the industry there.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you know, it's the most price driven of parts of the market, right? Short term. So obviously, with prices coming off, that can have some way on US production if we fast forward 6, 12, 18 months. Uh, but the picture is pretty clear ahead that the crude production growth is going to slow down and plateau probably within the next couple of years. But we will continue to see growth in NGLs, and that's what we've been seeing next year. I mean, everything's shifting more toward gas. The crude is getting more NGL oriented, and also they're developing more gas. So the U.S. will increasingly be sort of an NGL play in terms of what we see get out on the water.
Interesting, interesting. One more question for you, Jeff. Just you get to ask you to get your crystal ball out. You can't predict black swans because that would be
Yeah.
exactly, contradict the definition. But what would you be your key concern for energy markets next year? Is it volatility? Is it, that OPEC cohesion might break down as we see a weaker market? Is it geopolitics? What would be your top concern to make all market participants nervous?
Hmm. Well, when you say black swan, that's to me, it's things that just aren't on the radar screen at all for the market. So I mean, I things that I've tossed around are what if somehow peace broke out, Russia, Ukraine, or something happened where Putin left? That would have a huge impact on gas markets, I
Mm.
think, because not probably. I mean, the oil, the molecules are getting out, but it certainly would affect trade. It would affect gas in a big way, and I think have a large impact on prices, relative prices certainly. Other areas that the market is pricing in somewhat, but a collapse in China is the market worries about it, but a full-on economic collapse is something that is a bit I would say semi-black swan. And then we have the usual, what could happen with, supply disruptions. And if they're black swan supply disruptions, it means they aren't on our radar screen. But we know, I mean, that's clearly sort of one of those known unknowns that those can always come along and bite us. Yeah,
Dr. Jeff Brown, president of FGE, thanks so much today for joining us on Halftime Talk. It's been great to have your insights.
great. Thank you very much for having me.